Hello everyone and welcome to Azam Shop YouTube channel. And in this video, I'm going to discuss different ways that you can use in SwiftUI application to append the data that is coming from a different screen. What does that even mean, right? I mean, looking at right now, we have a user list screen and it doesn't really have any data to display. That's fine. But what if we have another component over here, a link on the top right hand corner, which allows us to add the data, and or a different screen will allow us to add the data. So this particular button is going to open a different screen, and then that data will eventually be displayed in our user list screen. So how can we do that, and what are different options that are available to us? So the first thing we need to do is we need to find out what kind of data are we talking about. And it will be simple. We're just going to use a struct for a user. So there's our user. It contains ID property and it contains the name property, and that's it. We're also going to create an HTTP client. Now keep that in mind that we're not going to make an actual request. You can see that we're just kind of like faking the request for 2 seconds. And then it returns some sort of a hard-coded data like John Doe. Okay, so we have the user, we have the HTTP client. How do we display these users on our user list screen? Again, we have multiple options over here, right? One of the options is to create our HTTP client over here. Let HTTP client equals to HTTP. Now, hold on a second. Now, many of you are wondering, hold on a second, don't you have to like inject this into the user list screen and you have to create a protocol for HTTP client? Absolutely. Absolutely. If you are using different HTTP clients, obviously for testing and development and production, then you should be injecting these things. But I'm just keeping things simple because the video is not really about the HTTP client itself or how do we inject things. The video is more about how are you communicating between two different screens and transferring the data. All right. So we have the HTTP client. I'm going to go ahead and create an array of users. Now, one thing to keep over here, keep in mind, is this is a local private state. This means that this particular state is only available in user list screen and nowhere else. Now, if I want to display these users, I'll simply display these users by displaying it in some sort of a list. And we're only displaying users name because that's the only property that they have. So we're just going to go ahead and display the name. Now, right now in our user list screen, we haven't really made the call to fetch the users. So where do we make that call? Again, we have multiple options over here. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to go ahead and use a task. Now over here, we can actually go ahead and create a function called load users. And we can fire that function like this. Now what is this function? Well, this function will be a simple function that is inside our view itself. And that is going to use HTTP client dot fetch users. This will be async. This can throw. So we're going to just go ahead, fetch the users, kind of like this. When it returns something, we're just going to assign it to the local state. Nice and simple. And you can already see that the users are getting fetched. Now this is all good, but the whole thing that we're trying to accomplish is that we should be able to add a new user, right? So how can we do that? Well, in order to do that, we will do a couple of different things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap this so that we can have the navigation bar at least on the top. I'm going to go ahead and also create a toolbar. There we go. I'm also going to create a property for is presented. Okay, so now we on the top right hand corner, we have add new user button. And when we press that button, we should be able to, well, create a new user, right? So let me go ahead and see if I can quickly do that. I'm just going to try to copy the code from my previous things. So let's go ahead and do that over here. Add user screen. Nothing complicated going on in add user screen. We have a state variable for name. Whenever the person types something in the name, that name state variable gets populated. We have a button called save, but it doesn't really do anything. It creates a user, but it doesn't really do anything. Well, the first thing we need to do is we need to make sure that we are displaying add user screen when the person taps on the add new user button. So for that, we can use sheets. It's presented. I'm going to use a binding over here. It's presented. And that's going to display us add user screen. Okay, good. But now comes the problem, right? This is the problem. When we display the add user screen, and we can click on it and it does display the add user screen, you can see this is the add user screen. The problem that we are facing is when it displays it and I go ahead and enter something and save it, what I want to do is when you call the save button, we create the user, we save the user or host the user through HTTP client. Okay, that's fine. I mean, that's other details that we can add later on. But after we pass the user to HTTP client and we add the user on our server, we get the user back. How do we add this user or the one that is already created from the server? How do we add that user to the array like this one? Because we have to make sure that the data on the server is in sync with the data that we are holding in our memory. So that becomes a little bit of hard, right? I mean, how can we do that? And this video is all about different kind of techniques. So the technique number one in our case is maybe what we can do is when we are calling add user screen over here, we can pass some sort of a function. So let's say private function add user, where you can pass in the user. And in this add user, we will say users.append the user. Okay, so it's a simple function that we have, which takes in a user and then finally adds it to the users array. And maybe we can try to pass this add user. But add user screen does not really take in an argument. So I can go to the add user screen and I can tell it that, hey, go ahead, there's a thing that we can pass in, which will be a function which will take in a user input argument, and it doesn't really return anything. And then once you get the user, we can call that. All right, it's a very common technique. Basically, you are passing a function as an argument, and then you call that function. It's like a callback function. When you call that function, it calls the actual function in our parent, which is user list screen, and then it appends into the users, which is maintained by user list screen right there. So this is one of the techniques that you can use. So let's go ahead and see if it works. So I'm going to say add new user. I'm going to say Mary, save, and when I dismiss, I can see Mary. Okay, so this looks like it is working. So that's kind of like our technique number one, where we are passing in some sort of a callback function, which is called back once the user is created. All right. Now you have to take into account that how you're creating the user. You have to create the post request. I'm just leaving out all those details because we are just focusing on how the data is passed from different screens or between different screens. So that's one of the techniques. All right. The other technique that we can use is we can probably, instead of saying add user over here and having a closure that takes in a user and returns nothing, we can use the power of SwiftUI and use binding. Users. So this means that someone, parent, is going to pass in the users as a binding. And once we have access to that, we can just go ahead and append it. So we don't really have to do any callback functions anymore. We can just use binding. So this is going to change our calling part. So no longer we have the add user, but we can have users as binding, and we're just going to pass in the binding users. Okay, so that means that we don't really need this add user function anymore. So let's go ahead and comment this out. There we go. Obviously, you should remove it. I'm just commenting it out, but you should remove it. Now, if I go add new user and I say Mary, okay, I can still see Mary. So this is all working perfectly fine. All right. And I think this technique is pretty decent if you're working on an app that doesn't drill down that much or doesn't have that much state to pass along. One of the technique that you can use is, and that will require you to create an environment object. So this means that this technique is fine, but you still end up passing the data to the different view. And if you are like passing to add user screen, then you're passing to user detail screen, then you're passing to some other, then the hierarchy can become, very, very long. So if you want to share the data between a lot of different views, then you can use the power of the environment object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very simple environment object over here. Now this is what usually people refer to as the view model. But one thing to note about this user store that we're creating, and it will be marked with observable, is that we're not creating this because we added the add user screen. We did not create this because we added user list screen. We added this because we are working with users. All right, because users is as source of truth. Now in a small app, you can actually have just one single store, and that's perfectly fine. And that can manage users, that can manage accounts, that can manage receipts, that can manage, that can manage receipts, that can manage budgets, and that can manage expenses. All right, so that's perfectly fine if you want to do that. As your application grows, you may end up having account store, receipt store, budget store, expense store, and so on. But always start with simple. So right now, I'm just going to call it user store because we are dealing with users. If you want to call it store, that's perfectly fine too. Okay, so we have the user store, and it will have a dependency on the HTTP client. So we're going to create the HTTP client part of it. Again, HTTP client over here will be protocol. If you need the protocol, you have to create it. And I'll create that dependency over here. I'll create that initializer. And the user store is going to manage the users itself. So I'm just going to go ahead and create an array of users. And we can have different functions to add a new user and to load the users. Basically the same function. I literally just copy pasted it. All right. Okay, add user, load user, delete user, update user, assign a different role to a user. Anything with user store is there to help you. So how do we use the user store? Well, I'm going to go ahead and inject that as an environment object. I'll say user store. Once I have injected it, and again, we have to make sure that we are injecting the HTTP client. Make sure that you inject the correct HTTP client. Right now, we only have one implementation, but you may have multiple implementations. So make sure you implement the client that is connecting to a development server instead of the production server. So user list screen. Now, in this case, we don't really need HTTP client. We don't need users. We don't need this part or this part. So we will probably go ahead and start deleting all of this stuff. So we don't need that. We don't need this. We do need to access the users, which we can now through the use of the user store. User store. Load users, we don't need it. Add user, everything is now inside the user store. So I can say user store dot users. Load, well, load is also, I believe, inside the user store, right? So load users. All right. And users over here. Okay, so what should we do with this part for the add user screen? Well, we can remove this because we don't need it. If add user screen needs some information, needs the users, it can actually go ahead and directly access it through the user store because that is a global state. And if they want to append it, store.add, oh, user store, right? So user store.add user and then user. And over here, I guess we have to use try and catch and all those things. You can create a separate function if you like that. That's perfectly fine too. There we go. So this is a different technique if you are working with SwiftUI, in which you have created a user store that manages everything about the users, and every single view, add user screen, user list screen, user detail screen, user profile screen, all of them can simply access user store to get the data, to update the data and everything. All right, so let's go ahead and try to run this again and see if it works. Okay, working as expected. And I think this is a little bit more cleaner because add user screen, you can see that we didn't really have to pass in anything to the add user screen because they can access it from the user store. Now, one of the things that people talk about is that, oh, hold on a second, all the different views that will be using, or all the different screens that will be using environment object over here, they will all be re-rendered. That's not really true. All right, they will not all be re-rendered because keep in mind that only the things that will be evaluated will be the ones that are in the navigation stack. Now, at a certain moment in time, how many views do you have that are in the navigation stack? I mean, okay, 10, 20, maybe 30, maybe 50? 50 navigation stack? I mean, your navigation has to be really complicated to do that. All right. And when you try to create a little bit like a smaller views, right? You are, let's say that if I can actually show you an example of a smaller view. Okay, let's see over here. Well, I guess we can extract this one out, right? See that list? We can extract this out into a smaller view. So I can go ahead and say user list view, which is a view. And we have to be a little bit careful over here because we should be passing only the stuff that is needed by the user list view. So what we can do is we can say users, user. And instead of this part, if you want, you can actually use user list view, passing in the users, which is store.users, user store. I keep saying stores, user store.users. All right. So inside the user list view, you're not really going to be accessing the environment store or the user store environment. You are simply going to be going through the list of users and displaying it. All right, so users, user in. The effect will exactly be the same, but now it's going to track, it's going to find out, it's going to see that if the users are actually changed, then the user list view is going to get re-rendered again. All right, so now the SwiftUI knows about the dependency of the user list view in the user. So only when the users are going to change, this user list view is going to be reevaluated, and then certain parts will be re-rendered. And I think that is something that you should be doing when you are working with SwiftUI, creating smaller views and passing smaller amounts of data to those views, only the data that is required. Now, my view is not really complicated, but I can even extract this one out, the text, into something else, like a user cell view or user detail or something like that. But I don't want to do it right now because it's not really much going on. All right. So we covered couple of or three different techniques of passing the data from one screen, which is shown as a sheet or a modal, to the parent screen. What kind of techniques do you use when you are working with Swift UI? So I would like to hear from you. And one more thing I'd like to mention, and that one thing is that if you like this video and you want to support my channel, then the best way would be to check out my website, azamsharp.school. And in azamsharp.school, you can see there are a lot of different courses that are available. These are high quality courses. I'm currently working on a course on Supabase, and it's a really good course. We've covered authentication, relationships, CRUD operation storage, and the next part will be on the real-time database. I have courses on SwiftUI architecture. You can check out those courses. Reactive programming, core data, MV pattern, full stack iOS development using Vapor. You're not going to get these courses anywhere else. And I also have workshops. Now, these are live workshops, hands-on workshops. They're close to like 2.5 to 3 hours. And the next workshop is on machine learning in iOS using CreateML. And that is coming on August 17. And we're going to learn about image classification, sentiment analysis. We're going to learn about object detection and even tabular data. And look at the price. I made sure that everyone can attend these workshops. So these workshops usually can cost up to like $300, $400, even $600, $800, but I'm giving you for only $89, so which is basically free workshop. All right. And I have some other workshops that are coming up on server. We have workshops on Swift data fundamentals, workshops coming up on testing, very good, very important workshop, and then even on Supabase in October. So these are really amazing workshops coming up in the future, and I really hope that you will be able to enjoy the courses as well as the workshops. So check out azamsharp.school. Thank you very much.